It all started when I got the invitation to what was supposed to be the biggest Halloween bash in the city. Every year, people in our town go all out for Halloween. The decorations, the costumes, the parties. It's a tradition. I never thought much of it, usually opting to stay home, pass out candy, and maybe watch a few horror movies. But this year, something was different. The invitation came in an old crinkled envelope with no return address. The paper was yellowed, almost brittle, like it had been sitting in someone's attic for decades. On the front, my name was written in what looked like a fancy hand-drawn calligraphy. I stared at it for a while before carefully peeling it open. Inside was a black card, the kind of card you'd expect to see at a high-end event or an exclusive gala. The writing was in deep red ink, almost too dark to read in the dim light of my apartment. It said, "You are cordially invited to the Night of Masks, October 31st, 9 p.m. The Ashmore House. Come alone. Wear a mask." That was it. No host name, no RSVP number, just the address and instructions. I stared at the card for a while, trying to recall where I had heard of the Ashmore House. The name felt familiar, but not in a good way. I Googled it and immediately got that sinking feeling you get when you realize you're about to step into something you shouldn't. The Ashmore House had been abandoned for decades. It sat on the edge of town, down a long, tree-lined road, the kind of place kids dared each other to go near. There were stories about it, urban legends mostly, people disappearing, strange lights at night, but nothing concrete, just enough to keep people away. I tossed the invitation aside and tried to forget about it, but something kept pulling me back to it. That night I dreamed about the house. I could see its crumbling walls, the overgrown yard, the shadows moving inside the windows. When I woke up, the invitation was the first thing I looked at. By the time Halloween rolled around, I had convinced myself it would be fun. After all, the invitation was probably part of some elaborate prank or a themed party. Maybe some rich eccentric wanted to scare people for the night. I figured I'd check it out for a little while, have a few drinks, and leave before things got too weird. I bought a simple black mask and threw on a dark suit. Something low-key, nothing flashy. The address was etched in my mind as I drove down the long, empty road toward the house. The further I went, the darker it got. Streetlights became scarce, and the only illumination came from the headlights cutting through the thick fog that had rolled in. The Ashmore House came into view, sitting at the end of a gravel driveway. It was even more decrepit than I had imagined. The roof sagged in the middle, the windows were boarded up, and the front yard was choked with weeds. But there were cars parked along the driveway, expensive ones. This was a party. It had to be. I parked at the end of the line and made my way toward the entrance, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. As I approached the house, I noticed something odd. There were no sounds of a party. No music, no laughter, nothing. Just the distant rustling of leaves in the cold October wind. The front door was slightly ajar, and a faint flickering light came from inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The inside of the house was just as decayed as the outside. The walls were peeling, and the air was thick with dust. Old chandeliers hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen force. There was a fire burning in the massive stone fireplace, casting long shadows across the room. And then I saw them. Dozens of people, all wearing masks, all standing perfectly still, facing the fireplace. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, suits and gowns that looked like they belonged in the 19th century. None of them spoke or moved. They just stood there, staring at the flames. I was about to turn and leave when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, startled, and found myself face to face with a man in a silver mask. His eyes were hidden behind the mask's intricate designs, and his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You're late," he said. "The ceremony is about to begin." "Ceremony?" I asked, glancing around nervously. "What are you talking about?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed my arm and pulled me further into the room. The masked figures turned toward me as I was led to the center of the room, their eyes following my every move. "Wait, what is this?" I stammered, trying to pull away, but the man's grip was like iron. He didn't answer, just kept pulling me forward until we reached a large wooden door at the back of the room. It creaked open on its own, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase that led down into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as the man pushed me toward the stairs. "You were invited," he said, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "Now it's time to meet the host." I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I felt like I couldn't move, like my legs had turned to stone. I had no choice but to descend the staircase, my hand gripping the cold, rusty railing as I made my way down. The air grew colder the further I went, and the only light came from a few flickering candles that lined the walls. Finally, I reached the bottom, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The room was circular, with a high ceiling that disappeared into darkness. In the center was a stone altar, and standing around it were the same masked figures from upstairs. But they weren't just standing, they were chanting, their voices low and rhythmic, like some ancient ritual. And on the altar lay a body. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The body was wrapped in old tattered cloth, but the outline was unmistakable. It was a person. I couldn't see their face, but I could see their chest rising and falling slowly, as if they were still alive. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, backing up toward the stairs. Before I could take another step, the door at the top slammed shut. I was trapped. The chanting grew louder, filling the room, and I felt a pressure in my chest like I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with something ancient and malevolent. The masked figures began to move, slowly circling the altar, their voices rising in pitch. I backed up until my back hit the cold stone wall, my eyes darting around for any possible escape. And then suddenly, the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening. The masked figures turned to face me, their expressions hidden behind their elaborate masks, but I could feel their eyes on me, burning into my skin. The figure on the altar sat up. The cloth fell away, revealing a man's face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. He looked like he had been dead for days, yet he was moving, sitting up as if he had just awoken from a long sleep. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch in horror as the man slowly stood, his joints creaking and cracking like old wood. He stepped down from the altar and walked toward me, his dead eyes locked on mine. I don't know how, but I finally found the strength to run. I bolted up the stairs, my heart racing, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, pushing through the door at the top and into the night. I don't remember how I made it back to my car. The next thing I knew, I was speeding down the empty road, away from the Ashmore house, away from whatever the hell had just happened. I never went back, and I never found out who sent the invitation. But every Halloween since then, I get the same card in the mail, black with red ink. And I know one day I won't be able to run. I've never really believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, monsters, those were just things people told themselves to explain the unexplained. I was always the skeptic, the one who would roll my eyes when friends told their so-called ghost stories. But after last Halloween, I don't laugh at those stories anymore. It started as a pretty standard Halloween night. My friend Eric had just inherited this old house from his great-aunt, a big 2-story place that sat at the edge of the woods, far enough from town that it felt isolated, but not so far that you felt completely cut off. It was perfect for our small group's plan to skip the crowded Halloween festivities and just hang out, maybe watch some horror movies, and crash there for the night. When I pulled up to the house, it was just about dusk. The sky was that deep orange fading into purple, and there was a chill in the air. Eric's house wasn't exactly in the best shape. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and the whole place had this vibe like it was just waiting to collapse. Still, it was Halloween, and the creepy atmosphere kind of added to the night. I parked my car and grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat. Eric had been texting me all day, hyped about having the place to ourselves. He said Sarah and Marcus had already arrived, so I figured I'd be the last one to show up, as usual. I knocked on the door, and Eric opened it, grinning like an idiot. He was dressed in a half-assed zombie hunter costume, complete with fake blood splattered across his face. I, of course, hadn't bothered with a costume. Halloween just wasn't my thing. "Finally, man! Took you long enough?" Eric said, handing me a beer as I stepped inside. "Get in here, we're about to start the movie." The house smelled like old wood and dust, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The place had a strange energy to it, like time had stopped here a long time ago, and no one had bothered to restart it. Sarah and Marcus were lounging on the couch, already a few beers deep. Sarah had dressed up as a witch, complete with a pointy hat, and Marcus had thrown on a werewolf mask that was already halfway off his face. "Finally," Sarah teased. "We thought you were too scared to show up." "Yeah, right," I said, rolling my eyes. You wish. We settled in, beers in hand, and started watching some old horror movie that Eric insisted was a classic. It wasn't long before we were all talking over it, laughing at the cheesy effects and making fun of the ridiculous plot. For a while, it was a pretty good time, but as the night dragged on and the movies got worse, I started to feel off. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was just the house, the way it seemed to creak and groan with every gust of wind, or how the shadows seemed to move just a little too much. It felt like the kind of place where something bad had happened, or would happen, but I didn't say anything. I wasn't about to be the guy who freaks out on Halloween night. Then we heard the first knock. It was soft at first, like someone barely tapping on the door. I thought I imagined it until Marcus muted the TV, his eyes narrowing. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked. We all listened. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then the knock came again, a little louder this time. Eric stood up, frowning. "What the hell?" I didn't invite anyone else. Sarah looked around nervously. "Maybe it's trick-or-treaters? Out here?" I asked, glancing out the window. The house was surrounded by trees, and the only other house was way down the road. No kids would be out this far. Eric grabbed his flashlight and headed to the door, the rest of us trailing behind him. When he opened it, there was no one there. The porch was empty, the front yard shrouded in darkness, with only the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. "Probably some kids messing with us," Eric muttered, stepping out onto the porch and shining the light around. We stood there for a moment, waiting, but the night remained quiet. No footsteps, no laughter, nothing. "Okay, weird," Sarah said as Eric closed the door. We shrugged it off and went back to our movie, but the vibe had changed. Every creak of the house felt louder, every shadow darker, and it didn't help that the temperature in the room had dropped significantly since we heard the knock. Another hour passed. We were in the middle of some slasher flick when the knock came again. This time, it was much louder, 3 heavy, deliberate knocks that echoed through the house. Eric looked pale as he grabbed the flashlight again, muttering something under his breath. He flung the door open, and again, nothing. But this time, there was something different. On the porch, right in front of the door, was a pumpkin. It hadn't been there earlier, and it wasn't carved in any normal way. Its face was jagged and twisted, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through us. "What the actual?" Marcus started, but Eric cut him off. "This is a prank," he said, but his voice lacked confidence. "Someone's messing with us." "Who?" I asked, stepping closer to the door. "There's no one out here." Eric slammed the door shut, looking genuinely rattled now. We all were. The night suddenly felt suffocating, the walls of the house closing in on us. "I don't like this," Sarah said, wrapping her arms around herself. "It feels wrong." "Maybe we should just call it a night," Marcus suggested, but none of us moved. It was like we were all waiting for something to happen. Something worse. That's when the lights flickered. The power cut out for just a second, and when it came back, we heard it. A slow, steady knock. Not from the front door this time, but from somewhere deeper in the house. The basement, we all froze. None of us had been down there. Eric had mentioned earlier that he hadn't even opened the basement door since he'd moved in. The knock came again, louder, and my stomach twisted into knots. "Someone's in the house," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric grabbed the flashlight and headed toward the basement door, his hand trembling. We all followed, too scared to stay behind, but too terrified to go forward. When he opened the basement door, the smell hit us. Musty, old, and rotten, like something had been decaying down there for a long time. The stairs creaked as Eric slowly descended, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. As we followed him down, the cold hit me first. The basement was freezing, way colder than the rest of the house. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and that's when we saw it. In the center of the basement, another pumpkin sat, identical to the one on the porch. Only this time there was something else. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the flashlight, tall, unmoving, its face hidden in the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct telling me to run. The flashlight flickered again, and I thought I saw eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And then the light went out. In the darkness, I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming toward us from the figure. Panic surged through me. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind us. We didn't bother to lock it, we just grabbed our stuff and ran. We didn't stop until we were back in town, breathless and shaking. None of us said a word as we piled into our cars and drove away from that house, away from whatever had been waiting for us in the basement. Eric sold the house a week later, practically giving it away. He didn't care about the money. None of us ever went back, and we never talked about what we saw that night. But every Halloween, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, that figure is still standing there, waiting for the next group of fools to come knocking. And I pray I never see it again. I never thought Halloween would be anything but another night at home, handing out candy and watching horror movies. That's what I'd done for years until I got a message from Scott, an old friend I hadn't spoken to in ages. The message was simple. You free tonight? Come to the old Hartwell house. There's going to be a Halloween party. You'll like it. Everyone in our town knew about the Hartwell house. It was an abandoned, decaying mansion on the outskirts of town, rumored to be haunted. People told stories about strange noises, lights flickering in the windows, and creepy voices that seemed to come from nowhere. But as far as I knew, no one dared to go inside. Despite the ominous location, I was intrigued. I hadn't seen Scott in a while, and Halloween at a supposedly haunted house sounded like something different. So I grabbed a simple black mask I had lying around from an old costume party and decided to check it out. When I got to the Hartwell house, it was even more run down than I remembered. The windows were shattered or boarded up, the front porch sagged, and weeds choked the yard. Several cars were parked along the driveway though, so it looked like I wasn't the only one Scott had invited. I put on my mask and headed inside. The front door was wide open, and there was dim lighting spilling out, casting long, eerie shadows. Inside, the atmosphere was even stranger. It wasn't a wild party like I expected. Instead, there were people scattered around, all wearing masks, quietly talking or just standing around. The music was low, barely noticeable. The whole vibe was unsettling. As I wandered through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. People kept staring at me from behind their masks, their eyes following me as I moved through the rooms. The whole place felt like a trap, like the walls were closing in. Eventually, I found Scott in the living room, leaning against the wall, sipping a drink. He was wearing a skull mask, and even though I couldn't see his face, I could tell something was off about him. He seemed tense, his eyes constantly darting around the room. "Hey man, this is something," I said, trying to lighten the mood. But Scott didn't respond right away. Instead, he grabbed my arm and leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "You need to leave." And I blinked, confused. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" "This place, it's not what it seems," he said, his grip tightening on my arm. "I shouldn't have brought you here." Before I could press him for more details, the lights flickered and the music stopped. Everyone in the room turned toward a large, ornate door at the far end of the living room that I hadn't noticed before. The door creaked open, and a tall figure stepped out. He was wearing a long black cloak and an intricately designed mask that looked like it had been hand-carved, old, and ancient. The figure moved slowly and deliberately, and the other masked guests parted to make room for him as he walked toward the center of the room. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a gleaming knife, placing it on the floor in front of him. My stomach dropped. This was not a party. This was something far more sinister. Scott grabbed my arm again, his voice trembling. "I told you, you need to go." But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at the cloaked figure as he pointed directly at me. Every masked person in the room turned to look at me, their eyes unblinking behind their masks. I broke free from Scott's grip and bolted for the door, but the hallway I had come down moments ago was gone. The house seemed to twist and shift around me, and every exit I tried was either locked or led me back to the same room. In desperation, I found a small, unmarked door at the end of a narrow hallway. I threw it open and stumbled into a dark, empty room. There was nothing in it except a tall, dusty mirror on the far wall and a single flickering light bulb above me. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, when I noticed something strange. In the mirror's reflection, I saw the cloaked figure standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, closer now, reaching out toward me. Suddenly, the door behind me flew open, and a cold, invisible force yanked me backward, pulling me into the darkness. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the house. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure stepping through the mirror, his mask shifting and warping as he reached for me. When I woke up, I was lying in the overgrown yard outside the Hartwell house. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the decrepit mansion. There were no cars in the driveway, no sign of Scott or anyone else. I stumbled to my feet, my mind racing. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? But as I drove away from the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Something that hadn't stayed behind in that haunted place. Something that had followed me home.